It's only the Mifa Wildbox. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. For a lot of you, this already fixed what you was missing from the sound core motion boom. What was that, Al? Well, auxiliary input for a start on the back. And some lovely lights. When I tested head-to-head the sound core motion boom versus the Mifa Wildbox, I said you could almost think of them as interchangeable. Basically the same speaker, but with different EQ. Other than the Mifa Wildbox, yep, it did go a little bit deeper, but for me, this is more on the clinical side. I laugh and giggle when I say clinical. I had a so-called self-proclaimed audiophile come on one of my videos and laughed at me because I can't possibly know about audio if I describe something as clinical. Well, of course, it does rely on the fact that you understand what clinical means. Clinical, in my world, means a little bit sterile, a little bit thin, a little bit lacking in life. Clinical. If you're an audiophile and obviously you have a reduced vocabulary, I'm very sorry about that. Hey ho, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. They seem to be doing well, but what did they do? They went and fixed it. Well, they wouldn't say fix it, they'll say they've improved it. There are some nice improvements coming down the road. This video is all about old firmware versus new firmware. I'm not sure what version the old firmware was, but I know looking online, because you can manually install the new firmware. The new firmware tested in this video is 2.03. Once you have installed the new firmware, I understand you will then, all future firmwares will either be via the app that is apparently coming, or indeed via the micro SD slot that's on the back of these speakers, and of course you can play music straight off these speakers via that micro SD card, and that alone is a reason for some people to be buying this speaker. So what we want to know is, yes, now we just want to know, has it changed the sound? Well, this may be the first time ever that we've got a firmware update and it doesn't say bugs fixed. One reason it doesn't just say bugs fixed is, well, as far as I can see, they haven't got the app up and running yet. And of course it needs this new firmware to run with it. But indeed, lots and lots of changes. So let me tell you what I picked up, what they are claiming for their new firmware. One, of course, is the lights have been drastically improved, because they don't just come on and off now. You will notice this is old firmware, this is new firmware. Lights doing nothing, and do you know why? Because there's no music playing. The other lights just did their own thing, music playing or not, but now they say works in time with the music. So lights doing nothing, I start playing music, and of course it's on the old one, but you can see the lights haven't changed. They're still doing exactly what they were doing before. What I will now do live is switch to the new firmware. Watch those lights, and you see what they did? They've gone all pretty and round. They're doing things so-called in time. I don't know, I wouldn't say it's in time exactly with the music, but it does things when the music's on, but not when the music is not playing. I will demonstrate that immediately. And it's not doing anything, and those lights are still going. Well, that's one of the dramatic changes. Now, they say improved the low volume level when the bass is weak. So you've got to take their premise as actually being solid. When the bass was weak, I didn't think the bass was weak on this. So already alarm bells a little bit. So they fixed the low volume level when the bass was weak. Well, what they're basically saying is when there's not that much bass in there. Oh, hang on a second, so that's good. Yes, well, because what they're saying is improve low frequency below 150 hertz by 1.5 decibels, but only through dynamic range compression. What is dynamic range compression? I'm glad you asked me that. It's making everything a bit level, but normally that also makes it a bit louder. But dynamic range compression can also help when you've got your home movie kit and you don't want sudden elbows to your equipment. You don't want sudden changes in the sound because it's a nice volume, it's a nice level. I can hear the vocals really well. Bang! Some bang! Some bang! Suddenly there was a big explosion, taking your ears off because you didn't want that sudden change. So dynamic range compression then would actually reduce some of those highs so you don't get sudden changes. What they're saying here is, at its most basic level, if you the elements in that track that are not loud are brought up to the rest to the rest of that track, and the elements that are too loud are brought down. So it's a leveling effect, and that normally means everything overall becomes louder because it's now more even. So you're adjusting just to the track itself rather than the sudden highs. Mid-range and treble are appropriately adjusted. So they're saying when they either boost or reduce the bass, and we're hoping they're going to increase it, at the very same time they're going to adjust the mids and the highs. That's all kind of worrying because, well, you're changing everything then. It was already seemed to our ears to be quite neutral and nicely tuned. Enhanced the brightness of the human voice to make the overall sound more balanced and soft. Adjusted the high frequency to enhance the overall detail performance and sound width. Sounds great on paper, doesn't it? Although there's a lot of things they're saying they're adjusting on a speaker that weren't broke, so the sound level is more distinct. Optimized for small scenes and bedrooms. So they're saying somehow they're optimizing it. I don't know, do they think most people are listening in small bedrooms, smaller rooms, more boomy? You might want to reduce some of that bass. So lots of things to look at in our testing. First thing I will do is a frequency response test using pink noise. It's a bit of a change from what I've been doing, but this time with pink noise rather than a sine wave sweep.
Old firmware, reasonably flat, yes, quite wavy, 3 kHz and above, bit of a roll off as we go past 10 kHz into the harmonics, and a decent bass. On the new firmware, it's a big change. Flick backwards and forwards, you can see it's almost like a tilt control. We're tilting up the highs, we're centering it around 800 Hz. 60% volume, overlay old firmware, new firmware, 600 Hz to a kilohertz. Not much has changed, and then the tilt control comes into effect. You get slightly more brighter and brighter and increasingly brighter as you go towards the high end, and then the opposite effect on the bass, less and less bass as you go into the deeper bass. The biggest difference is in the harmonics past that 10 kHz region, where it's filled in not only the rolled off high, but it's boosted it as well.
Saying it's dynamic, maybe in a real world track it's going to be different, but I have to say I don't really get that. So our first little bit of testing says reduced bass, increased highs, so less balanced, more of an upward slope, and not quite as neutral as it was. It had a nice big bass. That appears to be reduced, especially if you increase the highs as well. That's going to, again, even more take away from that bass because the overall balance has changed. So the same dynamic would then depend on the actual tracks you're playing, but a reduction in bass doesn't tally at all to dynamic compression to bring up the lower levels. Then just leave the high levels alone if you're thinking the bass is too high. But that was with pink noise, so it should be balanced. 40% of volume test, old firmware versus new firmware.
So tired of that song, tired of that song, tired of that song, tired of that. Just wanna go home, wanna go home, wanna go home. So tired of that song, tired of that song, tired of that song, tired of. Just wanna go home, wanna go home, wanna go home. So tired of that song, tired of that song, tired of that song, tired of. Just wanna go home, wanna go home, wanna go home. Strangers, killing my lonely nights with strangers. Unbelief they go back to our song. So I hold on, hurts like lost in the sun. Bus got season, like you're still around. Can't miss you, and I need you now. Yeah. I'm so tired of that song, tired of that song, tired of that song, tired of. Just wanna go home, wanna go home, wanna go home. So tired of that song, tired of that song, tired of that song, tired of. Just wanna go home, wanna go home, wanna go home. I'm so tired of that song, tired of that song, tired of that song, tired of. Just wanna go home, wanna go home, wanna go home.
40% volume, as we saw in the frequency response results, it's like a tilt control. Less bass, more highs, centered around 800 Hz, 850 Hz, around a 3 decibel gain around the 9 kHz mark, and then a 3 decibel approximate loss around 60 Hz into the deeper bass. And very different now in the overall sound signature. We've lost 3.5 decibels in overall bass, and the deeper you go, the bigger the loss. By 50 Hz, it's 4 decibels.
Real world track, it appears to be the same result as the pink noise test. We got less bass, we got more in the highs. They have achieved a sound that's crisper, and it has more air. You know, they've greatly increased the boost at the 10 kHz plus range. That's where you're going to get more air. I find that quite track dependent, and on some tracks it can sound really honky if you over egg. Especially you do it like the JBL way, where it's just a single band, about 12, 13 kilohertz. That to me sounds electronic and honky. It's better implemented, I think, on the Mifa Wildbox. It's not so honky. Certainly gives more air, but again, it just robs it of a little bit of life. It's giving too much focus to the highs at the same time as the bass is reduced. I don't really understand that. That's not really what my understanding of dynamic range compression should be all about. You're just trying to, and they said at low volumes. I mean, that's not that low volume, but it's lowish volumes, 40%. So maybe it's going to change as we go up the volume scale. Overall bass now, we were 4 decibels down. Well, at 50 Hz, we're 4 decibels down. And indeed, about 3.5 decibels in the overall bass. I mean, that's massive. I mean, you take a speaker that we thought was quite nice, was well received, don't get any negative comments about it at all, which is quite rare on a speaker, and then they change it dramatically. I really don't get that, and it's not really working for me at 40%. Up the volumes, Alan Ross reviews real world volumes are about 70%.
Paris, can you feel the love? I'll take you to Paris. Just go right this way. Everybody's got their own demons. Wanna face mine with you. Wanna face mine with you. Fallen spring gave me a new reason. Oh, gotta fall and grow like leaves. I will always focus on what's best for me. When I see your body, there's no in between. I can't get tired, cause you're my new routine. I swear you're blowing my mind. I'll take you to Paris. Can you feel the love? I'll take you to Paris. Just go right this way. Don't wanna be late. Head charts to go skate. Don't wanna stay here or come back home. Come back home. Don't wanna be late, cause nothing's the same now. I'll take you anywhere you want.
70% volume, and the difference is not quite as exaggerated as you're getting at lower volumes, but it's still the same. We're getting less bass, we're getting more highs, and it's centering around 800 Hz mark. We're losing about 2.5 decibels in total bass, but we're still 4 decibels down by 50 Hz. And in terms of the highs, we're 3 decibels more in terms of the highs. But it's adding the loss in the bass with the increase in the highs that exaggerates the overall differences. Overlay original track, and perhaps the old firmware is maybe the more natural firmware. It's not as exaggerated at the high end. It's keeping its upper bass just a little bit boosted as we get into the deeper bass, but that's not necessarily a bad thing.
It's as you go up the volume scale, clearly the differences become less, but they are still very obvious, and for me too much. So now, what was a difference of about 3.5 decibels in overall bass, we're now down to nearer 2.5 decibels, but it's still a big difference. The overall signature has changed. We're now at less bass, a more crisp, thinner. I didn't think it needed to be thinner. They could have, it only needed a little bit more in the vocals, a little bit more air, 10 kilohertz and above. Would have been a nice subtle change. For me, this is too much. Too much because it's changing, I think, what we already liked about the Mifa Wildbox. So, we've got a handle now. We know the sound is it's gonna be different to your ears. Some people are gonna like that. It's gonna depend on the state of your hearing and of course what room, or if you're indeed outside. The extra clarity, the extra air, yes, a lot of people are gonna like that. Other things will stand out, although it's not quite natural to my ears. But without underpinning it with that nice warm bass now. The bass is there, but it's lessened. It's lessened not just because there's less bass, but because it's that less bass is emphasized by the increased brighter sound. If we'd never heard the old firmware, we'd probably be saying, well, that sounds nice, that's a nice clear sound, might be one for the purists. But that's not the case. We did have a warmer sound, which I personally preferred on the old firmware. What happens when you go to maximum volume? I'm going to tell you right now.
100% volume. The differences are close enough that you'd have to listen out for them, but they are still there. 2 decibels up in the highs for new firmware, but a decibel down in overall bass on that new firmware. In terms of original track, the bass is rolling off now. In terms of the new firmware, it is exaggerated now in terms of the highs, but of course that also means it's going louder. It's going louder by about half a decibel.
So it's consistent. The louder you go, the less of a difference there is between old firmware and new firmware, but there's never a point where they sound the same. Even at maximum volume, okay, we're down to a decibel in overall bass difference between them, but the advantage is still to the old firmware. And in terms of the highs, 2 decibels up. So 1 decibel less in the bass, 2 decibels more in the highs, adds up to an overall brighter, thinner sound. Just a little bit more in the high, just a little bit more to emphasize the vocals probably would have been perfect to me. I wouldn't have touched the bass at all. Wasn't really, I don't really know. I've never even got any complaints about low volume listening. Obviously, not everybody comes to my channel. You can see that by the number of subscribers. Yes, it's increasing, and I think that's fantastic. I'm not knocking myself in any way, let alone other reviews. But obviously, the feedback I'm getting is a smaller sample than the Mifa themselves are getting. So there you go. That's been my comparison of the Mifa Wildbox. And what's it got? It's got tweeters. We love tweeters. And just to quickly go over some of the specs in case you really didn't know what the speakers are all about. I can't see it on Amazon at all now. How much you're going to expect to pay? Between about 100 quid and $130 seems to be the ballpark figure. Got a reasonable 37 watt-hour battery. It is SBC codec. It does support 2 devices, multi-point connection, Bluetooth 5. Here's the thing, don't get caught out. It's got a lovely party ad button, and you can link up 100 plus party ad speakers, but it's not stereo. It's not stereo on the old firmware. It's not stereo on the new firmware. It does not do TWS, true wireless stereo pairing. So don't get caught out thinking you can buy a pair and hook them up in stereo. You can't. It's got USB-C connection. It's got all auxiliary input. Can use it as a power bank. You cannot use it to make phone calls. It's got that card slot. A lot of people will buy it just for the fact that it's got a card slot and you can play music straight off of the speaker itself. It's got lights, and now the lights, they don't do anything if the music is on, and they do things if their music is on, but is it in sync with the music? Probably not. It's on paper, a 60 watt speaker. I've done this specs thing to death. I'm just going to say 60 watts and say nothing else. It charges 5 volts, 3 amps, which is pretty good for the USB-C, because most of them come from will allow you to do about 10 watts. If you've got appropriate charger, 15 watts. 1.6 kilos. It's a decent weight. It's not light, it's not heavy. It's about looking at a speaker. It's about the weight that you're expecting. Sometimes you pick up speakers and it's so light, because it looks like it's a heavy speaker. Sometimes it's the other way round. It is IP67, 1 meter. You can drop it into 1 meter of water for 30 minutes. Why would you do that? But if you did, it would survive. But if it's deeper than 1 meter, you're still okay. Do you know why? Because it floats. Not all of them float. It's great when they float, so that's great. And IP67, the 6 means it's dust proof. So we've got the 2 woofers, we've got the 2 tweeters, we've got the 2 passive radiators. For me, 185 milliseconds was the testing on the old firmware. I haven't retested on the new firmware. Maybe you should have, Al, before you did the video. You're absolutely right, but you know what? I don't have unlimited time. I've got to do what I can do in the time God has given me. 185 milliseconds is really, really poor. That was on the old firmware. At an appropriate stage, I will retest that. Now, that's pretty much a wrap. Now you know the differences between old firmware and new firmware. Is it terrible out? No. I'm saying for me, I don't like it. But again, a bit like the Motion Boom Plus, some people will love it, and I can understand. I can see there are some speakers like the Huawei Enjoy, the Sony XB23, and there's weird things going on, because I had on the same video comments for both of those speakers, people saying they love it, even though it wasn't even about that speaker. That's weird. And the point I'm trying to make is there are some speakers I don't understand why anyone likes. Those XB23, Huawei Soundjoy, I can only assume anyone who's got that speaker, they've never had any other speakers ever in their life. So you're getting music. Wow, man, I got music. And you think that's great. But hey ho, if you've got a reference point, in my opinion, they're not good, and I don't understand what you're going on about. I'm trying to explain. Here's a case in point when I can say I don't particularly like the new firmware, but I can understand why a lot of people will. Because they won't want the heavy bass of the old firmware. They like the brighter, clearer sound of the new firmware. And if they're much older than me, of course, and their hearing's going because they're getting very, very old, then they may appreciate the extra highs. And if you're 18 with perfect hearing, you might, man, it's hurt my ears. Almost like the Motion Boom Plus. And by the way, if this hurts your ears, do not even think about the Motion Boom Plus. Although we've got new firmware, and that's going to come probably in the next video. I thank you for watching this one, and I hope to see you again.
I ain't about that life. I ain't about that life. Ain't no project wife, got my logic right, cause I'm not your type. I ain't about that life. I ain't about that life. Sorry, ma, I ain't get it right. I'ma just live my life. I ain't about that. I ain't about that life.